Well, we were having a quite animated conversation, Jim and I. Things are going to get a little less interesting now. It's a marvelous assumption that first you get all the equipment and you put it together and then you prop two people up like pieces of fried bread and hope they have something to say. But Jim said I should read a poem to get things off. It's a nice short poem called The Common Wisdom. I take that back. It's not nice at all. Ugly. The Common Wisdom. Their marriage is a good one. In our eyes, what makes a marriage good? Well, that the tether fray but not break, and that they stay together. One should be watching while the other dies. More truth than poetry in that.
Yes, I was just thinking about that. It's nice when you read a poem like that has a number.
Hold on a minute. We want to start over again.
Well, it's thought proper for me to begin by reading a poem, and Jim suggested the poem should be one called The Common Wisdom, which is short and not nice. Their marriage is a good one. In our eyes, what makes a marriage good? Well, that the tether fray but not break, and that they stay together. One should be watching while the other dies. There's more truth than poetry to that.
Well, there's both. I think it's wonderful for a reader to pick up a poem like that, that scans effectively, and that the rhymes fall into place in an exact manner, like those do, and to find that what you've read also contains a statement which is incontrovertible, but not ever put quite that way. You know, that just a line like one, speaking of people, of participants in a marriage, the main figures in a marriage, to say of them, one should be watching when the other dies, is a stark and in a way a shocking statement, but one thinks, yes, that's right. It's right. And the fact that this is couched in language which has this rhythmical component and the rhyming component in it makes it seem not only right, but super right.
Well, you can't make a fellow sore by saying things like that.
I know,
Why do you keep saying them?
But it brings into play larger questions about form and about the uses of rhyme in making such statements, and in making statements more memorable by such means than they would be by other means.
Yeah, well, of course, that's the way in which it comes. I've reflected lately that what poetry is about coming true. All these stories that when you're 18 are just marvelous sentences, then you notice they're happening. I noticed first a line of Keats, which I used to repeat when I was a child. When old age shall this generation waste. And I said to another poet, my God, it's coming true. And he said, yes, Howard, and there's another one that's coming true. They flee from me that sometime did me seek. And it's about, well, Shakespeare, you know, that's where Theseus says all that about poets and lunatics and lovers. He hasn't got the idea at all, but Hippolytus says a minute afterward, but all the story of the night told over and all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesseth than fancies images, and grows to something of great constancy, but howsoever strange and admirable. Ain't that? That's what it's about, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. I think it was the thing that fascinates me so much about the exercise of the craft or art of poetry, or whatever you would want to call it, is that there's so many ways of getting at the business of speaking what one thinks of as the truth, or a truth, or the coming into some kind of truth area by means of language. There's so many different ways of doing it, and so many different kinds of personalities see the same thing in different ways, and find verbal means that are so distinct from one another. You know, I mean, you take a plain-speaking poet like I just think of like Robert Frost and so on, who's got that way of getting at his version of the making of a truth, or the coming upon one, or making one happen. And then somebody like Hopkins or John Berryman, who gets at it through a most extreme form of mannerism, linguistic mannerism.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's the same as, it's the same alphabet, however many handwritings there are.
Yeah, but the handwritings themselves are really what we are interested in many cases, don't you think? Hart Crane really has very little to say.
Remarkably little.
Remarkably little, yeah. It's everything is in the linguistic mannerism, or means rather, that he uses.
I got a poem called Writing. Could I introduce that in evidence?
I wish you would, and read it too.
That's the only way we have of introducing things in evidence right now. It's just about the handwriting, So it's called Writing. The cursive crawl, the squared-off characters, these by themselves delight even without a meaning in a foreign language, in Chinese, for instance. Or when skaters curve all day across the lake, scoring their white records in ice. Being intelligible, these winding ways with their audacities and delicate hesitations, they become miraculous, so intimately out there at the pen's point or brush's tip do world and spirit wed. The small bones of the wrist balance against great skeletons of stars exactly. The blind bat surveys his way by echo alone. Still, the point of style is character. The universe induces a different tremor in every hand, from the Czech forger's to that of the Emperor Huizong, who called his own calligraphy the slender gold. A nervous man writes nervously of a nervous world, and so on. Miraculous, it is as though the world were a great writing. Having said so much, let us allow there is more to the world than writing. Continental faults are not bare, convoluted fissures in the brain. Not only must the skaters soon go home, also the hard inscription of their skates is scored across the open water, which long remembers nothing, neither wind nor wake.
Yes, it's like that, the writing, the different kinds of writing.
Little squiggles.
But all on water, even if it's at one time ice.
Yeah.
It's not always ice.
Looks like ice.
I wonder if you had anything like the same experience. I think it's maybe in some ways similar to mine. We were about the same age, and we were in the Second War. Did you begin to write poetry before you were in the service? Or
yes, I began in college. I discovered the day after I got to college that all the smartest, richest, most precious, and arrogant sons of bitches around the place said they were poets.
I never knew any of those. All the ones I knew were football players, and not very good ones, like I was not very good.
So I said, that's for me. So that day I became a poet. I went to the bookstore and bought my little copy of T.S. Eliot like everybody else.
Goodness.
And put my Mark Van Doren's Anthology of World Poetry in translation under the bed so nobody would know. Of course, it was a long time after I became a poet that I first wrote a poem. I think it's essential to become a poet first.
It was, I don't know exactly my case, exactly when it started, but it seemed to be sometime in my very late adolescence when I began to get some notion that some people could say things more effectively than other people.
I remember a piece you wrote about your first experiencing that rightness of language in relation to the soldier's phrase, to sweat it out.
Yes, Sure, the Army was full of those. That was one of the better ones. There were a lot of scatological metaphors and so on that were not very good and haven't survived because they didn't have the element of both imagination and truth that a statement or anything couched in words has to have before it will be remembered at all by anybody.
Well, that's what I like so much about poetry, is a quality it shares with jokes.
Yeah, I think
saying something so you know it stays said.
Yes, I thought news that stays news. Somebody said. Sure, I do. I like that too. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is availing ourselves of the means of poetry is to get such a high concentration of language, using every means that language affords, to engrave some sort of statement, rhythmical statement on people's consciousness, and people that will be around long after we're gone. To say something.
I don't like thoughts like that.
To say something definitive in some way, or at least something that people would take, if not as definitive, at least something that they've got to consider.
Yeah, but you'll allow. The purpose of sex is to produce offspring, but it's not what you're thinking of at the time.
Yeah, no.
Same with poetry. You may want to be immortal, but what I chiefly value is what damn fun it is when you can do it.
I don't think anybody could go. So an American poet could not go on without that feeling. And the sense of exploration.
It's such a wonderful privilege to see the thing begin to take shape. You're banging away with your
and you have absolute
exercises.
Control over it.
Well, that's the illusion.
The illusion, yes. I remember reading the biography of Malcolm Lowry, who had a wretched sort of life, and he was living for one time in a squatter shack up around Vancouver at a place called Dollarton. And he built this little shack out of driftwood and all that, and he would paint it different colors, and blue one year and all that sort of thing. And someone said, why don't you writing? Why you keep painting and doing all these menial jobs around this little nondescript place where you live? You just painted the whole interior of the house. He said, well, I like to do it. It makes me feel like a god. There's something like that about writing poetry.
Well, you feel it most when you can't do it. And for 2 years at a time, nothing happens, and you sit there and you mope and think that everything is over, and then one day the voice begins to speak again somehow.
Yeah, and it's not your voice either. I wouldn't say yours, but it's not one's voice.
It's not personal.
It's not. This is as close. A feeling of that sort is the closest I've ever had to what used to be called inspiration, or seizure, as Plato calls it.
It's a kind of impersonal happiness. You feel as if you're high above the typewriter, a little bit dizzy.
Yeah, right.
Jimmy Merrill has a wonderful metaphor about that at the end of a poem about Eros and Psyche. He's told the story, and he's looking down, and he describes this amphitheater, and you think, well, that's the Greek amphitheater at Epidaurus, maybe, the stone seats in a semicircle pointed down and focused on the stage. Then you realize it's the semicircle of typewriter keys he's looking down into, which has exactly the same form.
Shape, yes.
And remember then that the letters are also called characters. Beautiful piece.
Would you read something I like so we could have it for posterity?
Why, sure. You can find something you like.
Fontenelle.
Oh, if you can stand my horrible French, it's got a line or two in French.
That's all right. This is a college.
Oh, yes, we learned about the French tongue, huh? All righty. Yeah, Fontenelle's a very strange and funny figure. Should say for the learned university audience that Fontenelle was an early popularizer, or as Henry Adams would say, vulgarizer of science. And he lived to be 100 years old. That's the two facts you must have. Fontenelle. At night, passing the open door of the power station, you look inside at an immense, immaculate, lofty space of marble floors and green iron grill work climbing on windows cathedrally tall. The shields of their backs showing as giant humps, the dynamos gleam deep in their own light. They have been sunk partly into the floor and set apart behind railings, as man sets apart whatever he would find famous and disturbing, the way the great globe is in the Daily News building, or Grant is in Grant's tomb. An old man in a gray sweater sits by the door, the night watchman, reading a comic book. Sometimes he stops to spit on the floor, and after the comic book, he has an obscene magazine. It is a long night in the power plant. Fontenelle wrote these books, among others: The Apologie des tourbillons, Le Dialogue des morts, The Entretien sur la pluralité des mondes. He lived to be 100 years old. The dynamos, deep sunken in their own light, hum to themselves, not of the dragon's wake, the moonlit rinsings of the China Sea, not of the wind in the furnace of the north. They are of the type called self-exciting. Someone asked Fontenelle, did he never laugh? Non, non, monsieur, je ne fais jamais ah, ah, ah. And when he got to be 100 years old, somebody asked him what he felt about being 100 years old. Rien, seulement une certaine difficulté d'être.
Not much, only a certain difficulty in being. That's funny. What this brings up something I've been wanting to ask you about for years. That poem with the marvelous subtlety about the night watchman or the caretaker with the obscene magazine, and the dynamos, which are of the type known as self-exciting. So I'm sure that a careless reader would miss the subtlety of that.
Well, it ain't all that subtle.
Well, they because you have references to so many other things. A number of philosophical works and
what I don't know about dynamos and electricity would fill large volumes. So I was delighted to come across that idea that some dynamos are of the type called self-exciting.
But it's extremely funny, and it partakes. Or perhaps is engendered by that quality that we call, for want of a better word, wit, which is a wide-ranging kind of word and was maybe more popular in the 18th century than it is now, and is used for much other purposes now than it was then.
Well, we use the word imagination, where they used to call things wit and judgment. We say imagination and reason.
Sure. But in our sort of more narrow definition of wit, we like as not tend to think of this as maybe not one of the higher concomitants of poetic excellence.
Well, sometimes it's been fashionable and other times not. I've always enjoyed living in a period in which it is not fashionable because you have so little competition.
Yeah, well, competition or not, it seems to me that very, very few poets writing today display any of it or much of it, and you do.
Though they despise wit, they wouldn't like to be called witless, would they?
Or have wit. No, they wouldn't.
Or as a friend of mine said about me, he said, Howard's a great wit. Of course, he said that statement is only half true.
That's right. Yeah, right. But it is it's something that affords enjoyment and also a good deal of illumination.
Well, it's wonderful, the things that language allows you to do that nobody else has done before, as far as I can make out. I really do make up my own jokes. They come to me when I'm out walking. I don't really versify things from Joe Miller's joke book. Once in a great while, each child has given me about one little epigram. So it's one good reason for having children.
Yeah, I think the business about jokes is much to the point. I don't know exactly what point I have in mind quite, but I do know that I watch comedians semi-faithfully on television because it struck me one evening watching somebody that I thought was particularly original and amusing, that there's a good deal in common between the comedian and his jokes and the poet and what he's trying to do. They set a scene of some sort or set up a situation of some sort, and then they try to pay it off in some way.
Try to make
or
it
other.
say something that'll keep people quiet.
Yeah, right. But the quality of wit itself is one that's, because of its rarity, is much more to be esteemed amongst us. I don't mean to limit your own achievement and your own particular way of writing to that one quality alone, but your poetry does have a very great deal of it, and I think that has not been given the exact kind of credit that it should have.
Well, there's time for that after I'm through.
It won't be a while, I hope.
I hope.
Do you think that all the hard-breathing type of romanticism known as confessional poetry and so on has run more or less its course, or you think that's going to go on a while? Or?
What have they got to confess? Nobody ever confessed anything that got him put in jail even.
No.
And the girls have great advantage because they can have abortions, cesareans, and other things to confess that we can't.
Well, we can do some pretty bad things too. But
We do terrible things, But mostly what people confess is how miserable they are.
Yeah, right. This is true. That's had a great impact when a practitioner of the so-called confessional mode, as powerful as Lowell was the chief one in view, but it's I question whether it's a totally laudable thing to have happened to the sensibility.
Even suffering has conventions once it gets in poetry. There's a form of student poem that's made a genre by itself. My father in the hospital with tubes up his nose and blood patched into him from somebody else. They do it and do it and do it. And I say, well, as a father myself and of a certain age, I would not stand for my kids writing poems like that about me. They better keep it quiet if they do.
There's such a determined emphasis on the ugly and the sordid.
Yes.
I don't mind that. I've seen plenty of sordidness and.
The world is miserable, but poetry doesn't exist to add to the sum of misery.
Well, I think not. I don't. They can be as miserable as they like and write about it as much as they like. But it bothers me when critics or certain critics seem to equate that with reality and with the only reality. Which is quite a mistake, I think.
The world was just as miserable for Mozart as it is for us, and probably somewhat more so. It isn't that music just didn't fall into place; he made it. And but you read King Lear, which is about a collection of people behaving about as badly to each other as possible. If you behaved like that to the cat, the SPCA would be at the front door instantly. But when you read it, it is not your terrible weakness you feel. You feel about 10 feet high, that somebody could say all that way, It's magnificence.
Yes, I remember, I think it was one of the popularizers of Clifton Fadiman I believe it was. It was talking about the heroic virtues and so on, and in relationship to the Iliad. And he said the Iliad is about a war which probably never took place, or certainly not under those terms at all. And it was a minor skirmish thousands of years ago, and not historically important, and so on. On the other hand, Eisenhower's book, Crusade in Europe, is one of the most important historical events. It records one of the most important events of all of human history, but there's no stature in it, or elevation. When you, as you say, to use your phrase, he says, you feel 10 feet tall when you read Homer, and you feel maybe slightly less than ordinary size when you read Eisenhower.
Well, there was much that was admirable about Eisenhower. Think how many people have conquered vast territories at the head of armies and not gone on to become tyrants and dictators, but
True enough.
go back, be a college president of your country. Remarkable. You notice that after making fun of him, especially his prose, the whole time he was in office, the minute he got out, everybody found all this untold of wisdom. He invented military-industrial complex, which reporters can't stop using.
Or students, especially when they're on strike. Yeah, well, sure. I don't know if you're like me in this regard, but I feel that the human imagination is available in a lot of forms other than high poetry.
Yes, indeed.
It's there in jokes, in the sports pages, in all kinds of journalism, and it's not forbidden to anybody to say something or try to say something in a distinctive and insightful manner. You know, and I take it wherever I can find it.
Yeah, I make my students bring in a saying every week, every class.
A saying.
Just anything. They can make it up. They can hear it somewhere. It can be a joke, or they go for a little crummy wisdom at the beginning. You got to laugh them out of that. You know, things like, because I passed this way but once. You say, nonsense. That's not what I want. I want things that snap, crackle, and pop. And one of them come up with a nice thing. We were reading Divine Comedy. We got through hell. He said, "There's one book where you get through hell. It's all uphill after that." That's nice. I said, sure, it's one book where you get through hell, you've got 2 to go.
But in keeping with what I was talking about earlier, about wit and so on, I'm a nut about aphoristic kind of reasoning and so on.
Yes, I like that very much.
I remember, and you again, since Auden, who relied rather heavily on that, or lightly on that sort of approach a good deal of the time, you're really the only one who can really bring something off. Like even in a novel, I remember one little thing from Federigo, or what is the subtitle? The Powers of Love.
Power of Love.
Power of Love. When you said one character said to so-and-so, whatever the character's name was, conscience was the still, small voice that says that no one's looking.
Says that someone is
That
looking.
someone is looking, yeah.
I think I swiped that from H.L. Mencken, though I don't know for
Really?
sure.
That someone is
A
looking. Yeah,
still
that's
small voice that tells you someone is looking.
Well, again, that has its own particular kind of memorability, built-in memorability factor.
In
But
fact,
it's got to be good.
You'll never forget it.
Nothing
once
is
you know
worse
it.
or flatter than something like that doesn't come off and doesn't work. It's a certain amount of real risk in wit or attempted wit, and that's you never fail to take the risk, and you almost invariably bring it off, and that's got to be applauded.
Well, thank you, Jim.
I can't do it.
It's fun to do. Well, you do quite a different thing.
Yeah, with wit, as you say, I only half get there.
Let's have a little microphone. Okay.
You, you tell me when we're going to do this.
We're going to do a quick closing.
Make me feel like Tom Snyder, or Dick Cavett or something. The eternal host.
Okay, if we can get your microphone back on.
Well, I don't have to say anything.
No, it's what he would like for you to do, if you could. Apparently, where he's looking at putting this in, you were both laughing. If you could just laugh a little bit and then say,
Laugh
a little bit.
Give us the laugh cue.
Okay, I'll give you a laugh cue.
That was pretty good.
I don't know if I keep it up.
Yeah.
Say something
Well,
witty.
Save it. Save it.
Thank you, Howard Nemerov, for being among us and speaking your version of how things are or where it's at or something.
Well, thank you for bringing out the poor best in me, Jim.
That's
Thank you
a
for
very
being
good
here.
best indeed.
Okay, good.